Fear is a feeling induced by perceived danger or threat that occurs in certain types of organisms, which causes a change in metabolic and organ functions and ultimately a change in behavior, such as fleeing, hiding, or freezing from perceived traumatic events. Fear in human beings may occur in response to a specific stimulus occurring in the present, or in anticipation or expectation of a future threat perceived as a risk to body or life. The fear response arises from the perception of danger leading to confrontation with or escape from, avoiding the threat, which in extreme cases of fear can be a freeze response paralysis. In humans and animals, fear is modulated by the process of cognition and learning. Thus, fear is judged as rational or appropriate and irrational or inappropriate. An irrational fear is called a phobia. Psychologists such as John B. Watson, Robert Plutchik, and Paul Ekman have suggested that there is only a small set of basic or innate emotions and that fear is one of them. This hypothesized set includes such emotions as acute stress reaction, anger, angst, anxiety, fright, horror, joy, panic, and sadness. Fear is closely related to, but should be distinguished from, the emotion anxiety, which occurs as the result of threats that are perceived to be uncontrollable or unavoidable. The fear response serves survival by generating appropriate behavioral responses, so it has been preserved throughout evolution. Signs and symptoms. Many physiological changes in the body are associated with fear, summarized as the fight-or-flight response, an inborn response for coping with danger. It works by accelerating the breathing rate, heart rate, constriction of the peripheral blood vessels leading to blushing and vasodilation of the central vessels, increasing muscle tension including the muscles attached to each hair follicle to contract and causing goosebumps, or more clinically, piloerection, sweating, increased blood glucose, increased serum calcium, increase in white blood cells called neutrophilic leukocytes, alertness leading to sleep disturbance, and butterflies in the stomach. This primitive mechanism may help an organism survive by either running away or fighting the danger. With the series of physiological changes, the consciousness realizes an emotion of fear. Causes. People develop specific fears as a result of learning. This has been studied in psychology as fear conditioning, beginning with John B. Watson's Little Albert experiment in 1920, which was inspired after observing a child with an irrational fear of dogs. In this study, an 11-month-old boy was conditioned to fear a white rat in the laboratory. The fear became generalized to include other white, furry objects, such as a rabbit dog, and even a ball of cotton. Fear can be learned by experiencing or watching a frightening traumatic accident. For example, if a child falls into a well and struggles to get out, he or she may develop a fear of wells, heights, enclosed spaces, or water. There are studies looking at areas of the brain that are affected in relation to fear. When looking at these areas, it was proposed that a person learns to fear regardless of whether they themselves have experienced trauma, or if they have observed the fear in others. In a study completed by Andreas Olson, Catherine I. Nearing and Elizabeth A. Phelps, the amygdala were affected both when subjects observed someone else being submitted to an aversive event, knowing that the same treatment awaited themselves, and when subjects were subsequently placed in a fear-provoking situation. This suggests that fear can develop in both conditions, not just simply from personal history. Fear is affected by cultural and historical context. For example, in the early 20th century, many Americans feared polio, a disease that cripples the body part it affects, leaving the body part immobilized for the rest of one's life. There are consistent cross-cultural differences in how people respond to fear. Display rules affect how likely people are to show the facial expression of fear and other emotions. Although many fears are learned, the capacity to fear is part of human nature. Many studies have found that certain fears are much more common than others. These fears are also easier to induce in the laboratory. This phenomenon is known as preparedness. Because early humans that were quick to fear dangerous situations were more likely to survive and reproduce, preparedness is theorized to be a genetic effect that is the result of natural selection. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, different fears may be different adaptations that have been useful in our evolutionary past. They may have developed during different time periods. Some fears, such as fear of heights, may be common to all mammals and developed during the Mesozoic period. Other fears, such as fear of snakes, may be common to all simians and developed during the Cenozoic time period. Still others, such as fear of mice and insects, may be unique to humans and developed during the Paleolithic and Neolithic time periods. Fear is high only if the observed risk and seriousness both are high, and is low if risk or seriousness is low. Top 10 types in the U.S. In a 2005 Gallup poll, a national sample of adolescents between the ages of 13 and 17 were asked what they feared the most. The question was open-ended and participants were able to say whatever they wanted. The top 10 fears were, in order: terrorist attacks, spiders, death, being a failure, war, criminal or gang violence, being alone, the future, and nuclear war. In an estimate of what people fear the most, book author Bill Tanzer analyzed the most frequent online queries that involved the phrase "a fear of," following the assumption that people tend to seek information on the issues that concern them the most. His top 10 list of fears, published 2008, consisted of flying, heights, clowns, intimacy, death, rejection, people, snakes, failure, and driving. Common phobias. According to surveys, some of the most common fears are of demons and ghosts, the existence of evil powers, cockroaches, spiders, snakes, heights, water, enclosed spaces, tunnels, bridges, needles, social rejection, failure, examinations and public speaking. Fear of death. Death anxiety is multidimensional. It covers fears related to one's own death, the death of others, a fear of the unknown after death, fear of obliteration, and fear of the dying process, which includes fear of a slow death and a painful death. The Yale philosopher Shelley Keegan examined fear of death in a 2007 Yale Open course by examining the following questions. Is fear of death a reasonable, appropriate response? What conditions are required and what are appropriate conditions for feeling fear of death? What is meant by fear, and how much fear is appropriate? According to Keegan, for fear in general to make sense, 3 conditions should be met. The object of fear needs to be something bad, there needs to be a non-negligible chance that the bad state of affairs will happen, and there needs to be some uncertainty about the bad state of affairs. The amount of fear should be appropriate to the size of the bad. If the 3 conditions aren't met, a fear is an inappropriate emotion. He argues that death does not meet the first 2 criteria, even if death is a deprivation of good things, and even if one believes in a painful afterlife. Because death is certain, it also does not meet the 3rd criterion. But he grants that the unpredictability of when one dies may be cause to a sense of fear. In a 2003 study of 167 women and 121 men aged 65 to 87, low self-efficacy predicted fear of the unknown after death and fear of dying for women and men better than demographics, social support, and physical health. Fear of death was measured by a multi-dimensional fear of death scale, which included the 8 subscales: fear of dying, a fear of the dead, fear of being destroyed, a fear for significant others, a fear of the unknown, a fear of conscious death, a fear for the body after death, and fear of premature death. In hierarchical multiple regression analysis, the most potent predictors of death fears were low spiritual health efficacy, defined as beliefs relating to one's perceived ability to generate spiritually based faith and inner strength, and low instrumental efficacy, defined as beliefs relating to one's perceived ability to manage activities of daily living. Psychologists have tested the hypothesis that fear of death motivates religious commitment, and assurances about an afterlife alleviate the fear, and empirical research on this topic has been equivocal. Religiosity can be related to fear of death when the afterlife is portrayed as time of punishment. Intrinsic religiosity, as opposed to mere formal religious involvement, has been found to be negatively correlated with death anxiety. In a 1976 study, people of various Christian denominations, those most firm in the faith, attending religious services weekly, were the least afraid of dying. The survey found a negative correlation between fear of death and religious concern. In a 2006 study of white Christian men and women, the hypothesis was tested that traditional, church-centered religiousness and institutionalized spiritual seeking are ways of approaching fear of death in old age. Both religiousness and spirituality were related to positive psychosocial functioning, but only church-centered religiousness protected subjects against the fear of death. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the unknown, or irrational fear, is caused by negative thinking which arises from anxiety. Many people are scared of the unknown. The irrational fear can branch out to many areas, such as the hereafter, the next 10 years, or even tomorrow. In these cases, specialists use false evidence appearing real as a definition. Being scared makes people to anticipate and aggravate of what may lie ahead rather than plan and evaluate, e.g., continuation of scholarly education. Most educators perceive this as a risk that may cause them fear and stress, and they would rather teach things they've been taught than go and do research. This can lead to habits such as laziness and procrastination. The ambiguity of situations that tend to be uncertain and unpredictable can cause anxiety. Other psychological and physical problems in some populations, especially those who engage it constantly, e.g. war-ridden conflict places, terrorism, abuse, etc. Poor parenting that instills fear can also debilitate children's psyche, development, personality. E.g., parents tell their children not to talk to strangers in order to protect them. In school, they would be motivated to not show fear in talking with strangers, but to be assertive and also aware of the risks and the environment that it takes place. Ambiguous and mixed messages like this can affect the self-esteem and self-confidence. Researchers say talking to strangers isn't something to be thwarted but allowed in a parent's presence if required. Developing a sense of equanimity to handle various situations is often advocated as an antidote to irrational fear, an essential skill by a number of ancient philosophies.